Well, this is lecture 5, and we're going to pick up where I left off with the Sermon on the Mount. And remember, I want to continue to press home the idea of Jesus as the fulfillment of Torah. All right, so we're hearing here the heart and soul of Jesus' own teaching as the new Moses, the greater Moses. He is not teaching a new law, as I've mentioned, but rather the fulfillment of the law. The true intent of the law all along was to lead to these particular ideals. Okay, and these are our standards for living. To be perfectly honest with you, as a 40-year-old man who has grown up in the church, I spent my third day in the world was spent in a church service. And every Sunday since, and most Wednesdays since, I've been in church twice on Sunday, going way back. And to be honest, I have to say I've heard very little teaching on the Sermon on the Mount relative to other areas of Scripture. I've heard a lot of emphasis in different places of Scripture. I hear a lot of Scriptures that aren't maybe the preacher or teacher's text, but be mentioned. There's certain maybe more memorable passages of Scripture that we tend to bring up a lot in our preaching and in our teaching. And as children of God, we tend to go to other places. And we often find the Sermon on the Mount difficult for whatever reason. And it can be very difficult to teach out of the Sermon on the Mount. But really, it is in so many ways the molten core of Jesus' character. It tells us in such an unvarnished, in such a pure and unadulterated way, what Jesus really expects of you as a child of God and how He views the differences between people. For instance, blessed are those who are X. Blessed, if Jesus considers this particular characteristic blessed, wouldn't you want to know that? If Jesus doesn't particularly care for a certain kind of reaction to or a response to something being done to you, wouldn't you want to know that? Again, if the person who's going to decide my eternal salvation, the person who's going to determine the fate of my soul, okay, if the person who's going to determine the unfolding of the rest of my life, if my own Creator tends to favor a certain kind of characteristic, wouldn't I want to know? Same thing for the people in the pew, the people trying to live the Christian life day in and day out. They want to know what kind of attribute, what kind of characteristic, what kind of lifestyle, what kind of behavior does God bless? All right? So I think much more attention should be paid as a Christian to the Sermon on the Mount, and perhaps even memorizing the entire Sermon on the Mount from beginning to end, knowing it so well. These are the teachings of Jesus when He sat down on the mountain and told His disciples, here are the kinds of people that are blessed. All right, so at the end of the last lecture, I talked about not resisting evil. Turn the other cheek also. I want to step back to something that was mentioned about bringing your gift to the altar. In chapter 5 of 23, bring your gift to the altar, and if you bring your gift to the altar and there rememberest that someone has aught against you, leave your gift at the altar. And I'm paraphrasing, go make things right. And once you've made things right with the brother who has aught against you, then come back and present your gift to the altar. Interesting. Jesus is urging, in spite of the centrality of the altar to the Jewish people. Everywhere Abraham went, he set up an altar. Everywhere Isaac and Jacob went, they set up altars. This is the first thing they did. They did that before they even set up their tents. Set up an altar. An altar here, altars dotting all over. In spite of the fact that there are not one, but two altars in the tabernacle and in the temple. Here's an instance in which Jesus is urging somebody to go away from the altar. When? When a brother has aught against you. Not when you have aught against a brother. Not when someone has grieved you, but when you sense that you have grieved someone else. You need to leave your gift at the altar and go and be reconciled. Remember, there was an emphasis upon making peace. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Here is a practical application of it. Okay, in the context of the first century Judaism, bringing your gift to a physical altar, it is completely inconsequential and superfluous to bring, for Jesus, to bring an altar, bring to the altar some kind of a sacrifice, some kind of a gift to God. But leave in your wake, back at home, back in the workplace, back wherever, a problem with a brother. Okay, remember, again, I brought this up a little earlier, I'll say it again. Remember that when Jesus was challenged for associating with the wrong people, eating dinner with publicans and sinners, Jesus says, you have forgotten that I have said, and quoting the Old Testament, I have desired mercy and not sacrifice. Go and learn what that means. Okay, so there is, for Jesus, not this centrality of the temple anymore, not the centrality of the altar, but the emphasis upon the sacrifice being primarily, or consisting, your gift to God consisting primarily of the way you treat people. Okay, remember, we're going to find out at the end of Matthew's Gospel in a parable that Jesus says that one day everyone will appear before the Lord, the sheep on the right, the goats on the left, and the human race will be divided accordingly. And then there's going to be this discussion from the Lord on the throne, and He's going to say, I was hungered, and you fed me. Thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came. And they're going to say, when did we ever see you in any of these very lowly, impoverished? You're sitting on the throne now. We never saw you in any of these situations. And the Lord is going to say, insomuch as you have done it unto the least of these, my brethren, so have you done it unto me. Speaking, the least of these, my brethren, is a reference to, again, the poor Christians, the Christians of the first century specifically that Matthew's writing to. As much as you've done the least. So, in other words, your Christian fellowship is your recipient for the gifts you give to God. Okay, so you never give a gift directly to God, but things have been set up in such a way that you bless God or you give to God by blessing people, by helping your Christian fellowship. This is very important. Mercy is exalted over, privileged over sacrifice. Some kind of a formal gift. Okay, so I think it's important to remember this all throughout Matthew's Gospel. There's always this emphasis on priorities, and the priority is reconciliation with the brother. Okay, now I should also mention that this phrase should ring, I think, ring true and your own recollection of the way in which you have lived for God. If you bring your gift to the altar and there remember that your brother has aught against you. Okay? Just the phrase. Let me put it this way. If at the altar you remember. If at the altar you remember. Now just think about that for a moment. For me, the altar has often been a recollection place, a place where I have remembered. I know that I'm at an altar whenever I'm remembering, whenever I become sensitive to the things that I have done, maybe against someone, in ways I've hurt someone. I remember one time getting into a heated discussion. My wife and I, we were in a heated discussion, and I pulled out to work. I went on my way. I was almost at work, 45 minutes down the road, and then I looked up in the rearview mirror of my car, and I saw behind me a mother and a child. And the mother, we were at a stoplight, the mother reached back into the back seat, the child was in the car seat, and she helped the child. The child was fussing or something, from what I could tell. And there was just something about that moment. I had left my wife very angry, and she had been tending to our oldest son. He was sitting in a high chair. I remember that was the last thing I saw. I'd left, and I was so angry. And then I saw at the stoplight, 45 minutes later, a mother caring for her child, and conviction settled over me, and I have never felt so lowly. I have never felt so convicted. I could not go into work that morning. I turned right around, went back home. And I'm sorry. Make things right. The altar was not, in this case, at the front of a church underneath a pulpit. It was not in some grand sanctuary somewhere. I knew that I was at an altar in the seat of a car, looking in the rearview mirror, because it was there that I remembered. I remembered. If at the altar you remember, the altar is always a place of memory. And so I think that's important to remember. For Jesus, the altar was a place of remembering. It's important to come to the altar, but even more important that once you have come to the altar for the purpose of giving a gift or whatever else, and you have remembered something, it's important. It's absolutely essential. You can go no farther in your walk with God, in your gift to God, until you have actually reversed course, gone back, made things right, become a peacemaker. Okay, that's the fulfillment of the law. The law makes provision for an altar. Okay, and you can offer your gift on the altar and try to make things okay with God, but that's only at the halfway house of the law. Okay, we want to fulfill the law. The complete fulfillment of the law is the purpose of the altar in the first place was to remember. Okay, so when you've remembered, you've gone back and done things right, then you have used the altar correctly in Jesus' view. All right. Now, let's talk about prayer. Jesus' teaching on prayer. I'm going to come back in just a moment to loving your enemy, but first on prayer. When you pray, don't be as the hypocrites are, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues, the corners of the streets, that they may be seen of men. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. But thou, when thou prayest, enter into thy closet, and when thou hast shut the door, pray to thy Father which is in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret shall reward thee openly. But when you pray, use not vain repetitions as the heathen do. Apparently, and we can see this from some of the texts that have been left behind, but a certain number of prayers said in a kind of a mantra was believed that these were believed to have some kind of efficacious power with God. To say them a certain number of times, Jesus urges us, no vain repetitions as the heathen do, but he's not just excoriating the heathen here for using these empty repetitions. That's not Jesus' point. If all you take away from Jesus here saying, don't make vain repetitions as the heathens do, if all you take away from that is don't say all of these, don't use mantras in your prayer. The heathen do it this way. He's not pointing at the heathen here. That's not his target. His target is instead a certain attitude towards prayer. And the attitude that Jesus is looking for in prayer is the prayer, the person who's praying, understanding who it is that's listening. The Father in heaven. It's not just merely God. It doesn't just merely use the word God, but the Father, thy Father. A father doesn't ignore the plaintive cry of the child. You don't have to say it over and over and over and over and over again to impress him, because he's actually not just some kind of an impersonal being up there in space somewhere, but he's actually your Father. Your Father. He could not help but hear and sympathize with you. Okay, so Jesus urges you away from vain repetitions, not because vain repetitions are somehow inherently evil, but because they're based upon a misunderstanding of who God is. Okay, they think they shall be heard for their much speaking, but be ye not therefore like unto them, for your Father knows what things you have need of before you ask them. After this manner therefore pray ye. All right, and you all know this. But do you know this? Lord's Prayer in the context of the whole gospel. Are you bringing all that you have read before in Matthew's gospel to your reading of this prayer right here? If you don't, you're going to miss out on half of the significance of the Lord's Prayer. In particular, I want you to remember the temptations of Christ in the wilderness when we read this prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Oh, thy kingdom come. When did we hear about kingdoms earlier in the gospel? Remember, Satan said at the top of the mountain, bow to me, and I will give you all these kingdoms. Here, in the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come. Okay, so remember what we have read before. Bring that into your reading of the Lord's Prayer. Proceed. Give us this day our daily bread. When have we heard about bread before in Matthew's Gospel? Was that not the first temptation of Satan? Turn these stones into bread. Here Jesus says we're to pray for our daily bread. Okay, it's something that the Father provides. Okay, it's something not to be taken for granted. We don't ask for tomorrow's bread. We just ask for this bread today. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Lead us not into temptation. Lead us not into temptation. Matthew 4:1. Then was Jesus led up of the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted of the devil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. This is, it seems, a deliberate echo of the temptations of Christ. The Lord's Prayer, stunningly beautiful in any language. I was once given the privilege of hearing the Lord's Prayer spoken in 70 different languages, and I learned it in several different languages myself. And in every language I've ever used for this particular prayer, it's absolutely marvelously beautiful. In ancient English, it would sound something like, it has a very Germanic sound to it. And even with all of those harsh syllables and consonants mashed together in Anglo-Saxon, still absolutely beautiful. Fara ura thu theart in heaven and see thee namanjal God to be kumithin richa. Yawertha in wila on earth and swa in heaven. I could go on. It's just marvelously, absolutely beautiful. That's on the aesthetic level. But on the level of significance, in using this as kind of an answer to the temptations of the devil, there is the subtle suggestion here in Matthew's Gospel that prayer is our way through temptation. It is point for point the frustration of everything the enemy tries to do in derailing your walk with God. Once again, pray, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. He's called Father. First of all, first and foremost, it's not God who art in heaven. It's Father. And then our Father. It's not just my Father, or even just Jesus' Father, but our Father who art in heaven. There's this corporateness about this. So whenever I pray, Our Father, I'm also acknowledging that there are other people for whom He is Father as well, and therefore that makes me brother or sister. This, in just saying, Our Father, I have immediately entered into a family. A Father to whom I'm accountable, but also loved. And I'm also accountable to these brothers and sisters. They are in this kind of familial relationship with me. So my thinking is informed, my prayers themselves are informed not merely by my own selfish needs, but also I am acknowledging right front and center the corporateness of my prayer. Other people's needs. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. I know you know this, and I know I've read it once, but let me go through it again. Give us this day our daily bread. Remember, it was the want of bread in the wilderness, that the hunger of Israel that got them off track. Give us this day our daily bread. And then forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. There's this, not just my own mindfulness of my own wants, but also an acknowledgement right here, an implicit acknowledgement that I'm having to ask for forgiveness for my own sins. And I know that you expect me, God, also to forgive those who have sinned against me. Lead us not into temptation. Jesus himself was led into temptation. Jesus is asking us here to pray, not to be led into temptation. Okay, this was something Jesus was able to endure, but lead us not into temptation. Deliver us from evil. Thine is the kingdom. These are the kingdoms of the world, not something for me to have. Yours is the kingdom, the power and the glory forever and ever. Okay, so keeping in mind, always, 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 certain key important moments in John's Gospel and understanding how Matthew revisits them. We're supposed to hear echoes, not only of things that have been said in the Old Testament, but things that have been said already in Matthew's Gospel. Every time you see the word bread, think back to all the other times that this that this concept has been uttered. Temptation, how else has it, and you compare and contrast and watch what happens. Okay, now I said I needed to go back to chapter 5, the end of chapter 5. You have heard that it hath been said, thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. I alluded to this earlier. Let me re-emphasize. If you're in any kind of Christian ministry, and everyone is called to some kind of Christian ministry, Matthew's gospel all but assures us that we will be offended and insulted and hurt. We will be despitefully used as Christians. As followers of Christ, we are absolutely guaranteed it. But instead of looking at it or understanding it as only a loss to ourselves, if we could understand it as an opportunity, a prime opportunity to follow in the footsteps of Christ, then we will have honored the very reasons for which this gospel was written, to inform us of what Christ was like, what he expects, and what he blesses. Okay, I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, that you may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. Oh, there's that reference again. Remember, the child is known by the resemblance to the Father. That you may be children of your Father which is in heaven. Here is how you begin to resemble God. When you love your enemies. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Love your enemies. For God makes his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. From the United States, certain portions of the United States, since it's a fairly well-watered region of the world, rain comes frequently, and we very rarely have any kind of shortage of it, except in some places in the southwest of the United States. Very few droughts. I remember being in Israel and standing next to the Jordan River, and an Israeli soldier was standing next to me, and he said, his name was Itzhak, and Itzhak said to me, he said, I have been to the United States and I have stood at the Niagara Falls. And he said, the soldier said, I remember watching billions and billions of tons of water flow over the Niagara Falls every single second, and looking at and remembering our little trickle of water that comes down, we call it the Jordan. And oftentimes it's completely dry and nothing flowing. And that's all we have. And I remember praying to God and thinking, God, if we could just have 1 second of what's flowing over the Niagara, we would be set for years. I come from a well-watered area. And so we, in the United States, often see rain, very selfishly, as a kind of a curse upon us. It ruins our day. We have to stay inside. We have to walk around in umbrellas and coats. In the ancient Near East, however, especially in Israel, it's not the case. When rain comes, it's liquid gold falling from heaven. It is the favor and blessing of God. And here Jesus says that God makes the rain to fall upon the just and the unjust. And for Jesus, that was prime evidence that God loves the evil, even his own enemies. He loves those people. And it's a gift from heaven that he gives all the time. And it falls equally upon the people who are just and the people who are unjust. That's God's fairness, his sense of fairness, his sense of love. So there's a perfection in God's love that Jesus is alluding to, that you may be, if you will love your enemies, you will be known as children of your Father which is in heaven. If you love them which love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the publicans do the same? Publicans are the lowest people on the class scale. And I don't mean by upper class, middle class, lower class. I'm not talking about economics. Publicans happen to be often very wealthy. We're not talking about economics. But on this scale of nobility, graciousness, the publicans are in the very lowest. They're beneath the prostitutes. Even the publicans are able to love people who do good to them. But it takes a higher order of character to love somebody who despitefully uses you. And never will you show more evidence of being a child of God than when you love somebody who hates you, and tries to destroy your character. Again, when this happens, it's a terrible thing, but on the other hand, it is a gift from God. It is God holding out the clothing of Jesus and saying, here, try this on. Walk with it. See how it fits. And then these words, be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. Is Jesus urging us, Jesus telling us we can be perfect, sinless? No, the word perfect there is not sinlessness. It's, interestingly, the Greek word telos again. Remember, we had talked about this is the word that's often translated fulfill. You have achieved the goal. Jesus came to achieve the goal of the law, to take it to its highest heights for what it was created for. Okay? Now here, we're being urged to have perfect love, to achieve a fulfillment of the law of God, to love one another, love your neighbor, not love your friends, love your neighbor, that is, whomever God happens to place next to you. That's your responsibility. Okay? God brings people in and out of our lives. Our responsibility is merely to love those we happen to come in contact with. God brings them into contact with us. It's ordained of heaven. So anyway, it's evidence of God's perfect love. Now, again, the word perfect has the unfortunate sense always of meaning sinless. But it's not talking about virtue here. The word perfect used to have the sense of completeness, wholeness. The only sense I can remember or think of right now off the top of my head in which the word perfect still contains the sense of wholeness or completeness is when we refer to somebody as a perfect stranger. That doesn't mean they're a sinless stranger. It means that they are a complete stranger. Perfect. That's what the word perfect used to mean when the King James translators translated this. You're being asked to have the same kind of love for the way that you love the person who does so much for you is exactly how you're supposed to love the person who despitefully uses you. And when you do, you are going to be like your Father who is in heaven, who sends rain upon the just and the unjust and makes his sun to shine upon all equally. Okay, now earlier I had mentioned that Jesus prefers prayer to be in the closet rather than in public. He's going to prefer that alms or offering is given privately as possible, and that fasting be something that's not a public announcement. I see that a lot. I hear that a lot. I hear a lot of, I'm on a fast. Oh, that might be okay. The church is called a fast. I understand all of that. But When the fast, when you try to gain some kind of reward in terms of admiration from people, when you declare that you're on a fast, that's the end of your reward. You've actually defeated the purpose of the fast, which was to deny the flesh and to strengthen the spirit. Okay, but again, Jesus is not against public prayer, for he prayed publicly, although it was somewhat private. Sometimes he would go apart to pray, but oftentimes he prayed in the hearing of his apostles. He also was willing to give, to help the poor in public. It was a very public thing. So again, his problem is not so much with making sure that it is absolutely secret, but instead he's dealing with a particular singleness or devotion to fulfilling the law of God. It's a complete and utter devotion, meaning you're not operating with two different, what do they call it? Operating with two different books. Okay? Where an accountant keeps two sets of books. Okay? You don't want your mind, your heart to be divided that way. Where you are doing something that seems to honor God, but you're doing it for a display to receive earthly reward. Okay? You're keeping two sets of books. Okay, so over and over again in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is going to emphasize this kind of singleness of devotion. Don't pray in order to get human reward. Don't give offering in order to get human reward. Don't fast in order to get human reward. Don't do anything. Don't let the right hand know what your left hand does. It's something that Jesus says here in the Sermon on the Mount. He talks about the eye being single, full of light. He talks about narrow is the way and straight is the path. Now, this is not necessarily meant to say that only a few people are going to go to heaven, though that I cannot make any pronouncement upon that. I have no idea. I'm not in charge of that decision. But I don't think in Matthew's Gospel, on the Sermon on the Mount, that Jesus is talking about the relative small number of people that are going to go on to glory versus the people that are going to go on to hell. I don't think that that is actually the intent of Jesus' saying, straight is the way, narrow is the gate that leads unto life, but broad is the way that leads unto destruction. Instead, this is following along in a theme that the Christian way, the way of Christ, is actually going to be a very single-minded, a very narrow devotion, a singleness of purpose. You're not double-minded. You're not keeping two sets of books. You're very, very focused upon achieving the law. You don't have one kind of love for your friends and another kind of love for your enemies. You have one kind of love for your friends and for your enemies. Okay? Complete singleness. That's Jesus' purpose in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is going to say, no man can serve two masters. You'll hate the one and love the other, or love the one and hate the other. No two ways about it. It's a single-minded devotion. Now Jesus is going to talk about, in the end of chapter 6, about the way you should approach each and every day. Now, this is going to be the outworking of Jesus, of that phrase in Jesus' prayer, give us this day our daily bread. Very important to think about how Jesus wants us to emphasize what's happening right now versus what's going to happen tomorrow. Jesus teaches very clearly that the follower of Christ is to completely trust in God because God is the Father in heaven. He's actually a father. And when you regard him as a father, you tend to worry less about tomorrow. And you tend to focus upon today. Now, I have often been guilty of thinking about how I'm going to tackle tomorrow's problem or next week's problem, next month's problem. And when all of these problems start to mount, and I'm not just dealing with today's issues, but I'm actually dealing with tomorrow's issues today. I'm actually seeing tomorrow outside the lens of grace. We're supposed to, God gives us just enough grace or bread for today. Just enough bread or grace for today. So when we look at today's problems, we're given enough strength to overcome. But when we start looking at tomorrow's problems, tomorrow's deficiencies, we're not seeing it through the lens of grace, and this is a recipe for being overwhelmed, for being stressed, for being depressed, and all kinds of problems. And Jesus wants us, again, not to keep two sets of books, not to worry about today's problems and tomorrow's problems, but to understand that we have a Father in heaven who every day, just like manna, He gives us just enough manna for today. And then tomorrow we have to go out and take manna again. And then the next day, every day, we're given not enough for tomorrow and today, but just enough for today. All right? So asking for our daily bread is a consequence of this complete trust. I don't need to ask God for tomorrow's bread today because I know He'll give it tomorrow. All I'm asking for is today's. All right? So take no thought for your life, what you shall eat or what you shall drink, nor yet for your body what you shall put on. Is not the life more than meat, the body than raiment? Behold the fowls of the air, for they sow not, neither do they reap, gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feedeth them. This is a remarkable observation, and an incredibly comforting observation. I remember one time walking down a street in St. Louis, Missouri, on my way back to a college dorm. And I remember walking by all these different houses and seeing the golden light, and I'm in the twilight of the evening, seeing the golden light from all these living rooms and dining rooms coming out of the windows and pouring out onto the street, and looking in and seeing families sitting around tables and eating together. Smelling the food. That I was around dinner time, so every house I'm walking by, I'm smelling dinner, and I'm getting hungrier as I go. And then I look up into the trees and I see there's a bird's nest up in here, and there's a mother bird feeding all these different little chicks. And I thought, how remarkable it is that there's somebody in each of these places, somebody who's taking care of all of these people. How stressful it would be if I had to take care of all of these different people. I'm so insufficient. How does God do it? How does He place mothers in our lives to give that which is sufficient for today? Everybody is taken care of. God intends to take care of absolutely everybody, from human beings all the way down to the insect world. There's a parable about Solomon and the fish that Arab Christians still tell to this day. And the story goes that one day Solomon said to God that, I'm wise enough now to feed the whole world. I have figured out a system in order to take care of the whole world. I can do this. I can feed all of the fish of the sea through my wisdom. So turn this task over to me. God, don't feed anybody or feed any of the fish of the sea. I'll take care of it. And so God says, okay, go ahead, take care of the fish today. And so Solomon uses these intricate networks that he's created of people in barns with all the storehouse of foods strategically set up. And he creates a chain of people, of servants, to go from the storehouses all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. And they take all of the food, pass it one down to the other, from servant to servant to servant, until at last the miles have passed and the food is dropped into the Mediterranean Sea, and all the fish come up and they eat all of the food. And when a last basket of food has been passed down through the chain, has been dumped into the sea, and has been eaten by the fish, Solomon breathes a great big sigh of relief, and he looks around in all of his glory and says, Look what I have accomplished. And all of the children of Israel rejoiced because their king was wise as God to feed the fish of the sea. But then, a little perch climbs up out of the surface of the sea, pokes his head out and says, "Say, when's lunch?" I love that story. How does God take care of all of this? His eye is on the sparrow. He has already he attends the funeral of each and every bird that falls from the sky. This is his level of care. So why are you worried about tomorrow? All you have been asked to pray for is your daily bread, today's, because you have a Father in heaven. And all of these anxieties that you have, you try to serve God, but you also serve mammon. That is money. You want possessions, you want things, and so you want lots of money, and so you want to have this purchasing power, and you can bring it all in, bring it to yourself and have it. But what happens to people, what tends to happen to people who try to accumulate everything and protect themselves entirely by wealth, what tends to happen to these people is first they want their wealth to serve them, but pretty soon they end up becoming slaves to their wealth. And they're always worried about guarding their wealth. And so for the rest of their lives, they have to become these kinds of dragons sitting upon a pile of gold, snarling at anyone that comes by. This is what Jesus is trying to guard against, is a misunderstanding of life, misunderstanding of who it is that's in heaven. You have a Father who's in heaven. Therefore, don't be thinking about tomorrow. Don't be thinking about how you're going to make yourself so much better. For actually, Jesus says, the lilies of the field, not one day had they spent working to try to make themselves more beautiful. Not one day have they ever pursued beauty. But Solomon, in all of his glory, was never, ever arrayed in such beauty, clothed in such glory as a single lily of the field who was brought up by the gentle word of God into life and flowered, blossomed. So part of your singleness of devotion and understanding that it is a Father who is in heaven watching over, is Jesus teaching that you should not behold the mote in your brother's eye without considering the beam that's in your own eye. So once again, instead of looking or keeping two sets of books and trying to correct everyone else, but forgetting about your own problems, your singleness of devotion needs to be upon compassion and concern for other people, but turning your eyes of judgment first upon yourself to make sure that you are fulfilling the law and that you are perfect in your own love before ever setting out to correct everyone else. And boy, if we could only learn this from Jesus. So, you hypocrite, Jesus says, cast out the beam out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly enough to cast the mote out of your brother's eye. All right, so from beginning to end in the Sermon on the Mount, this focus upon Jesus as the fulfillment of the law and how we're supposed to also fulfill the law. Keeping a singleness of purpose and understanding that we have it is a Father in heaven. Jesus ends the Sermon on the Mount with a discussion of what it will be like for the person who keeps the words of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Now, very important. Jesus says, whosoever hears these sayings of mine, what sayings? The sayings of the Sermon on the Mount, everything that he has just talked about, the singleness of devotion and understanding it is a Father in heaven who watches over. If you hear these sayings and do them, I will liken you to a wise man who builds his house upon a rock. The rains come, the winds blow, and they beat upon the house, but it doesn't fall because it's founded upon a rock. But the one who does not listen and perform these words of mine is going to be like someone who's house built upon the sand. When the rains come, the winds blow, it all falls away. Oh, this is what lasts forever, these teachings. And I think we're seeing evidence in our world of many houses built upon the sands. Come back, Christian minister, apostolic believer, to the Sermon on the Mount and make it absolutely central to your understanding of who Christ is and what he expects and what he blesses.